All right, back for more. Day 19 of our deep dive. And yesterday,
Yeah.
we sort of started peeling back the layers
Yeah.
on this whole world of nutraceuticals and prescription drugs. And
Right.
I don't know about you, but I'm ready to go even deeper.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot more to uncover.
Yeah.
Especially when we start thinking about the regulations and
Exactly.
how all of this stuff is controlled.
Yeah, it's fine to talk about,
Right.
like the benefits and the risks and all that, but how do we really know
Oh, yeah.
what's safe and effective? And that's where
That's right.
these regulatory frameworks come in.
Yeah.
And that's what we're really going to put under the microscope today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And especially focusing on safety, efficacy, and, those marketing claims.
Yeah. Those are always fun.
Oh, they're the best.
It's a fascinating area.
Yeah.
And one that has huge implications for
Oh, yeah.
our health and the choices we make.
Absolutely. So let's start with the basics. When we talk about regulations, we're really talking about like the rules of the game, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And in the U.S., the main player setting those rules is the
That's right.
FDA.
The Food and Drug Administration, they're responsible for making sure that all sorts of products are safe and effective.
Yep.
Everything from food to drugs to medical devices, cosmetics.
Yeah, and when we talk about food and drugs, there is a lot of overlap there, especially when we're thinking about nutraceuticals.
Yeah, nutraceuticals really kind of fall into this gray area between food and drugs, and that can make it really tricky to figure out how they should be regulated.
Yeah, absolutely. So to really understand all this complexity, we need to break things down.
Back it down,
So where do we even begin?
So I think a good place to start is with the legal framework that governs these products in the U.S., and that would be Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which is often just called the CFR.
Okay, the CFR.
It's basically,
It's pretty daunting.
It can be. It's a huge collection of rules and regulations that basically tell you, how these products need to be developed, manufactured, marketed, sold, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, so within this massive CFR, there are different sections for different cases.
You've got sections for food, dietary supplements, prescription drugs, you name it.
Okay.
Each section lays out,
right,
the specific requirements.
All right, that makes sense. So let's start with food. What are some of the key things the CFR focuses on when it comes to regulating food?
So when it comes to food, the primary focus is really on safety.
Okay.
And particularly preventing contamination.
Okay.
So the regulations cover everything from manufacturing practices to packaging to storage.
Okay.
It's all about making sure that the food that we eat is free from any harmful contaminants.
Okay, so when we're talking about contamination, are we talking about things like bacteria, pesticides, that sort of thing?
Yeah, things like microorganisms, chemicals, even physical objects, anything that could make the food unsafe.
Right.
So, for example, there are strict rules about separating raw and cooked foods during processing to prevent cross-contamination.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember a time when I was trying to be a fancy chef at home, and I used the same cutting board for raw chicken.
Oh, no.
And vegetables.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Not my finest moment.
But, in a commercial food processing facility, that kind of mistake could have really serious consequences. So that's why those regulations are there to minimize those risks.
So it's not just about the ingredients themselves, but the processes and how they're handled.
It's about the whole process from start to finish.
Okay, so we've got a pretty good handle on food regulations now.
Okay.
Let's move on to dietary supplements.
All right.
Which is where things start to get...
things get a little
more complicated.
A little more complicated,
right.
Yeah. So dietary supplements, they fall under a separate set of regulations, and those are outlined in Part 111 of the CFR.
Okay.
And while there are, some similarities with food regulations, there are also some key differences.
Okay, so how are the regulations for dietary supplements different from those for food?
So for one thing, manufacturers of dietary supplements,
okay,
they have to provide evidence that their products are safe. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean conducting, like, rigorous clinical trials like you would with a drug.
Right.
But they do have to show that the ingredients that they're using are safe for people to consume.
So it's a bit more stringent than just saying, like,
Okay.
hey, this fruit has been eaten for centuries.
Right, exactly.
So it must be fine.
You can't just assume that something's safe
Right.
just because it's natural or it's been used traditionally.
Right.
The FDA requires manufacturers to actually substantiate those safety claims.
Okay.
And they have the authority to take action against products that are deemed unsafe.
Okay. And what about efficacy?
Okay.
Do dietary supplements have to prove that they...
That's where things get a little trickier.
Okay.
So unlike prescription drugs, dietary supplements don't have to go through that same rigorous clinical trial process to prove that they're effective.
So does that mean they can make any claim?
Well, not exactly. While they don't have to, prove efficacy to the same extent as drugs, their marketing claims are still regulated.
Okay.
So the FDA requires that any claims made about, a supplement's health benefits have to be truthful and not misleading.
So there's a line there.
There's a line.
It's not just a free-for-all.
Exactly. It's not a free-for-all.
Okay.
And the FDA has actually taken action against companies that make, unsubstantiated or exaggerated claims about their products.
That's reassuring to know.
Yeah.
So with food and supplements, it seems like the focus is really on safety.
Primarily on safety.
With varying levels of scrutiny when it comes to efficacy claims.
That's right.
But when we move on to prescription drugs, things get a whole lot more serious.
Absolutely. Yeah, prescription drugs just represent a much higher level of risk and potential for harm.
Right.
So the regulations surrounding them are much, much more stringent.
Okay, so what are some of the key differences between the regulation of prescription drugs and those for food and supplements?
So I think the biggest difference is that prescription drugs... they have to demonstrate both safety and efficacy to get approval from the FDA.
Okay.
So that means they have to go through rigorous clinical trials to prove that they work for their intended use and that they don't cause unacceptable side effects.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like a no-brainer that a drug should have to prove it actually does what it's supposed to do.
It seems obvious, but it's a really important distinction.
Yeah.
And that's why the clinical trial process for prescription drugs is so extensive and so tightly regulated.
Okay.
It's all about making sure that the benefits outweigh the risks.
So we're talking about like a whole different level of scientific evidence.
Yeah, it's a much higher bar for prescription drugs compared to food and supplements.
Yeah.
And that evidence has to be generated through, well-designed, ethically conducted clinical trials that meet very strict regulatory standards.
And those standards are outlined in the CFR.
Yes, but the regulations for prescription drugs, they're actually spread across multiple parts of Title 21. So you've got regulations covering preclinical research, clinical trials, post-market surveillance.
Post-market surveillance.
Yeah.
What's that?
So that basically means that the FDA continues to monitor a drug even after it's been approved.
Wow.
And it's being used by patients.
Okay.
So they're collecting data on long-term effects, rare side effects, any other safety concerns that might come up.
So it's like a never-ending...
Yeah, it's an ongoing process.
Safety check to make sure that that drug continues to be...
Right, it's essential for protecting public health and making sure that those medications stay safe and effective even as we learn more about them over time.
All right, this is fascinating, but I think my brain needs a break.
I hear you. It's a lot to absorb.
Yeah.
Why don't we pause here?
Okay.
And we'll pick up with part 2 of our deep dive.
Right.
And then we can delve deeper into the specifics of those clinical trials.
Okay.
And really explore some of the challenges and ethical considerations involved in developing new drugs.
Sounds like a plan. We'll see you back here soon.
All right. See you then.
For more deep dive goodness.
More deep dive goodness.
All right. Welcome back to our deep dive.
Before the break, we were talking about those strict regulations surrounding prescription drugs, especially that whole thing about proving both safety and efficacy.
Yeah, you mentioned that clinical trials are kind of like the make or break point in that process, right?
Yeah.
It's where we actually see if a drug works and is safe for people.
Exactly. They're the foundation of evidence-based medicine, really. They give us the data we need to say, yep, this drug is good to go.
Okay, so let's break down these clinical trials. What actually happens in them, and how do they guarantee safety and efficacy for these new drugs?
Well, they're basically really controlled experiments, but on people. They test a new drug or treatment on a group of volunteers to see how it works in the body, how it's broken down, what side effects it might have, and ultimately if it actually does what it's supposed to.
So it's not just like popping a pill and seeing what happens. There's a whole system behind it, right?
Oh, absolutely. They follow a strict protocol, a super detailed plan for everything, from who participates to the dosage to how they collect and analyze the data. And these protocols are reviewed like crazy by agencies like the FDA to make sure they're ethical and scientifically sound.
That makes sense. We want to make sure these trials are done right, especially since we're talking about people's health.
Exactly. And speaking of ethics, one of the most important things is informed consent.
Right. Informed consent. Remind us what that means again.
Sure. Basically, it means that the folks participating in the trial know all about the risks and benefits, and they're choosing to be a part of it. They can also back out whenever they want, and their privacy is protected the whole time.
That seems like a pretty basic ethical thing, making sure people are participating freely and understand what they're getting into.
Absolutely. There are strict rules in place to make sure informed consent is done properly and people's rights are protected.
So these trials are carefully planned, ethically run, and super regulated. But how do researchers actually figure out if a drug is effective? I mean, it's not like there's a magic wand for that, right?
No magic wands here, just good old science. They use something called a control group.
Ah, the control group. Takes me back to high school science class. Remind me how that works again.
So basically, it's a group of people in the trial who don't get the experimental treatment. They might get a placebo, which is like a sugar pill, or the standard treatment for whatever condition is being studied. That way, researchers can compare the folks getting the new drug to the control group and see if the new drug is really making a difference.
It's like having a benchmark to compare against. If the group getting the new drug does way better than the control group, then you can say, hey, looks like this drug is working.
Exactly. And the better designed the trial is, the more confident we can be in those results. Like a double-blind, randomized controlled trial, that's like the gold standard because it eliminates bias as much as possible.
Okay, double-blind, randomized.
Yeah.
That sounds like a mouthful. Break it down for us.
Sure. Double-blind means that neither the people in the trial nor the researchers know who's getting the real deal and who's getting the placebo or standard treatment. This helps keep everyone honest, basically. And randomized means people are assigned to either group randomly, again, to minimize bias and keep the groups as similar as possible.
So it's all about, removing anything that could mess with the results and give a false impression of whether the drug is actually doing its job.
Exactly. That's why those well-designed trials are so important for showing if a new drug truly works.
Okay, we've covered safety, efficacy, and the whole control group thing. But these trials aren't just one and done, right? There are different phases involved, aren't there?
Yeah, you're right. Clinical trials usually go through several phases, each with a specific goal and more people participating as you go along.
Okay, so walk us through those phases.
So first up is phase 1. This is like the first time a drug is tested on humans. It's a small study with just a few healthy volunteers, and the main focus is on safety. Researchers are looking for any immediate side effects, figuring out safe dosage levels, and understanding how the drug is absorbed, broken down, and eliminated by the body.
So it's like dipping your toes in the water, making sure the drug isn't going to immediately cause problems before doing bigger studies?
Exactly. If the drug passes phase 1, it moves on to phase 2. This involves more people, usually folks who actually have the condition the drug is supposed to treat. Now, the focus shifts to efficacy, looking for early signs that the drug is working. They also keep an eye on safety and refine those dosage instructions.
So in phase 2, we start seeing if the drug is living up to the hype, so to speak.
Right. And if the phase 2 results look good, we move on to phase 3, the big one. This involves tons of people, maybe even thousands, and it's all about confirming that the drug works and is safe in a much larger and more diverse group. Phase 3 is also where we might catch those rare side effects that didn't show up in the smaller, earlier studies.
So phase 3 is like the final exam, the big test to see if this drug is ready for the real world.
You got it. And if a drug makes it through all 3 phases, all that data gets sent to the FDA for their review.
And that's where those strict regulations we talked about earlier really kick in.
Right. The FDA combs through all that data from the trials, looking at safety, efficacy, and making sure the benefits are greater than the risks. If they give the thumbs up, the drug can be marketed and sold to the public.
Wow, that's a long and complicated process. But it's good to know that there are so many checks and balances in place to make sure the medications we depend on are actually safe and effective.
Absolutely. But the story doesn't end there. Even after a drug gets approved and is out in the world, the FDA keeps watching it through post-market surveillance. They gather data from doctors and patients, track any bad reactions, and can even ask for more studies or change the drug's labeling if any safety concerns pop up.
So it's like a never-ending process, always checking and adjusting.
Exactly. It really shows how dedicated scientists, researchers, and regulators are to making sure the medications we use are as safe and effective as possible.
Well said. This has been a really interesting look into the world of clinical trials. But before we wrap up, I have one more question. We talked about how important control groups are for figuring out if a drug works. But are there situations where using a control group might be, ethically questionable?
That's a great question, and it's something researchers and ethicists grapple with constantly. There are definitely times when using a placebo, for instance, might raise some ethical red flags.
Like if withholding a treatment could have really serious consequences for the people participating.
Exactly. Imagine a trial for a new cancer drug. Is it right to deny a group of patients a potentially life-saving treatment by giving them a placebo? It's a tough question with no easy answers.
So how do researchers deal with these ethical dilemmas?
Well, there are guidelines about using control groups that say placebo controls should only be used when there's no effective treatment already out there, or when the risks of the new treatment are pretty minimal. And when withholding treatment is considered unethical, researchers might use what's called an active control, where they compare the new treatment to the current standard of care.
So it's about finding that balance between good science and ethics, making sure that the research is done responsibly and with the well-being of the participants at the forefront.
Absolutely. And those ethical considerations are always evolving as we learn more about human health and disease. It's an ongoing conversation, a really important one for advancing medical science.
This has been a fascinating dive into clinical trials. We've learned so much about how new drugs are developed and the strict process involved in bringing them to market. But our deep dive doesn't stop here. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll explore the world of drug impurities and how those are regulated. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive. Today, we've covered a lot of ground, from those regulations surrounding food and drugs to the ins and outs of clinical trials. But now, we're heading into a territory that you might not expect: the world of impurities.
Yeah, it's not the most glamorous topic, but it's super important when we're talking about making sure medications are safe and effective.
Okay, I have to admit, when I hear the word impurities, my mind goes straight to, finding a weird crumb in my bag of chips. Is that what we're dealing with here?
Well, not exactly. Those unwanted snacks are definitely impurities in the food world, but with pharmaceuticals, it's a bit more complicated.
All right, so give us the lowdown. What are impurities when we're talking about drug development?
Think of it this way. An impurity is any substance that's not supposed to be in the drug. It's like a party crasher sneaking into a VIP event. These uninvited guests can show up during manufacturing, sneak in while the drug is being stored, or even pop up as the drug breaks down over time.
So it's not just about the main ingredients, but also anything else that could be hanging out in that pill or liquid medication.
Exactly. And just like those party crashers, impurities can cause all sorts of problems. They can make the drug less safe, make it less effective, mess with its shelf life, even change how it tastes or looks.
Okay, now I see why this is a big deal. But how do these impurities even get into the drugs in the first place? Is it just a cleanliness issue?
Well, it can be, but often it's more than that.
Mm.
Sometimes the impurities are already in the materials they use to make the drug. Other times they're introduced during the manufacturing process itself.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, let's say they use a specific solvent to create the drug. If they don't completely remove that solvent, little bits of it can stain the final product.
Like those stubborn stains you just can't get out no matter how hard you try.
Exactly. And those leftover solvents can have unintended consequences, even be toxic if they're not controlled carefully. Then there are those sneaky impurities that pop up from unexpected side reactions during manufacturing.
Side reactions. Sounds like a baking experiment gone wrong.
A perfect comparison. Chemical reactions can be unpredictable, and sometimes those unexpected results can end up in the final drug. And don't forget about impurities that form as the drug breaks down over time, whether it's sitting on a shelf or even inside the body.
So even if a drug starts out perfectly pure, it can develop impurities as it ages. Kind of like that fruit salad that gets all brown and mushy if you leave it in the fridge too long.
Right. That's why drugs have expiration dates. Those chemical bonds start to weaken, and that leads to new, potentially harmful substances.
This is starting to sound a little scary. How do we even know what's hiding in our medications?
That's where the work of analytical chemists becomes crucial. They use supersensitive techniques to find and measure even the tiniest amounts of impurities.
So it's like having a microscopic detective on the case, scrutinizing every single molecule.
Exactly. And those analytical methods have to be super reliable to make sure they're accurate and sensitive enough to catch those impurities at the levels we expect them to be.
It's like double-checking your work, making sure no uninvited guests are slipping through the cracks.
Exactly. And remember those detailed regulatory frameworks we talked about earlier? Well, they're key players in controlling impurities, too.
So there are rules about how much impurity is allowed in a drug.
Absolutely. There are strict guidelines, like the ICH Q3A, Q3E guidelines. They provide a framework for identifying, measuring, and controlling impurities in both the drug substance and the final product.
ICH Q3A, Q3E, those sound like code names from a spy movie.
Think of them as the rule book for ensuring drug quality. They outline what's expected for impurity levels, how to test for them, and how to manufacture drugs to keep impurities to a minimum.
So it's a multi-layered defense system against those pesky impurities.
Exactly. And this whole area of impurity control is constantly evolving. As we get better technologies and learn more about drug chemistry, the guidelines and testing methods have to keep up. It's an ongoing process.
This has been a real eye-opener. I never really thought about this part of drug development before. It's amazing to see how much effort goes into making sure our medications are pure and safe.
It really is a complex process with a lot of moving parts.
Well, we hope this deep dive has given you a new appreciation for how drugs are developed, how they're regulated, and the crucial role those often invisible impurities play.
And as always, keep that curiosity going. Keep asking questions and join the conversation about the science, the ethics, and the future of medicine. It's a journey we're all on together.
Well said. And that wraps up another deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time for another fascinating exploration.